It's time for the 10th episode of Commodore 64 Games, and I've decided to focus the entire episode on simpler, early C64 classics, so the number of featured games today will ramp up to 20 rather than the usual 10. But with the early classics, there really isn't too much to talk about at a similar length as you might have with later ones. Of course, we're gonna start with a few important games from Commodore themselves, and the first game is Andrew Spencer's International Soccer. Because why not? I mean, it was released in 1983 and it was used as a basis for Emlyn Hughes' International Soccer, another highly rated soccer game on the C64 from several years later. Granted, it's not pretty to look at, but it sure beats most other competitors up to Emlyn Hughes and Microprose Soccer in gameplay and arguably even graphics. The computer AI is a very formidable opponent, particularly on higher levels, but it can also be played by two human players. Now, since this is a 1983 game, you shouldn't expect anything as complex for it to have as team modifications and optional formations, but at least you get to change shirt colors and a display setting between color and grayscale. Many C64 fans still consider this one of the best C64 soccer/football games of all time, even though it's one of the earliest ones. It's also one of the most common cartridge games to have, not just because the original cartridge is one of the most common ones around, but also because it was included on the Super Games compilation cartridge from 1988 and the 4-game compilation cartridge that was released with the launch of the Commodore 64 Games System in 1990, all of which I have in my collection. Wizard of War was an arcade game by Bally Midway from 1980, and many consider the C64 version one of the best arcade conversions of all time. Just don't confuse it with the other Commodore conversion of Wizard of War from 1982, originally published for the Japanese Commodore Max machine, which is much more basic in appearance and has no two-player mode. This classic maze shooter is a properly claustrophobic and frantic game, and the C64 execution of it is superb. If you have a Magic Voice cartridge, which I don't, you can apparently hear lots of additional speech bits, but I hardly think it is a necessary thing to have. Classic stuff, at any rate. One of the first games ever to be released for the Commodore 64 was another arcade conversion from Bally Midway's catalog, a 1981 vector graphics-based game, Omega Race, and it was one of the first C64 games to use paddles as the controller of choice. Some versions use a joystick, which is how I grew up knowing the game, but paddles is the way it was meant to be played. It's basically like Atari's Asteroids, but instead of the game happening within a looping area, you control your spaceship in a closed-up space, the boundaries of which bounce you off. The idea is, as usual, basically just to shoot all the mines and other enemies you might come across. Nothing particularly special, but similarly to International Soccer, the colors could be changed. From what I've seen on the internet, one of the most sought after and valuable cartridges these days is Dragonsden from 1983. I'm not exactly sure why, although it's a pretty good game in its own right, and one of the few original games released by Commodore in their first year. It borrows the main gameplay mechanics from Joust, but instead of a one-on-one battle kind of a deal, we have a single-player game with a plot to enter a dragon's den, waiting for the dragon's egg to hatch, and then kill the dragon by dealing a few hits of your lancer. game is played in 4 acts, after which a halftime animation plays and the game starts over with a higher difficulty level. Certainly one of the more entertaining games from Commodore's own catalog, and the soundtrack is sort of funny as well. Another one of my favorites from Commodore is Arctic Shipwreck from Fahrenheit 451 software, although I didn't really get to play this game until well after emulation came along. In this game, you play as a friendly mammoth in the Arctic, and your immediate surroundings have been occupied by people from a shipwreck. Of course, having survived the collision with a wrecked ship, you are now stuck on an unstable floating block of ice, along with a dozen or so human survivors, and your mission is to balance the block of ice in such a way as to keep everybody, or as many of them as possible, on the ice until a rescue boat arrives. Every now and then a bird will harass your group and try to snatch one of the people away, and you can try to drive the bird off. It's massive yet simple fun, and one of the most brilliant games Commodore ever released. And then we go back to Bally Midway arcade games with Blueprint, which, being from 1982 originally, was the most recent Bally Midway game for Commodore to do a conversion at that point. Blueprint is a mad maze game in which you need to build a machine to be able to fight against a monster running after your girl. To do this, you need to get into all the houses in the maze, and from within of them, gather parts of a machine as depicted in the blueprint at the bottom of the screen and bring them over the blueprint. Once the machine has been compiled, start the device by pushing a button and start blasting. You only have a certain amount of time to accomplish this, and you have to beware of bombs which you need to dispose, as well as weird looking spiders you also need to get rid of. Good fun for a while every now and then, and to its advantage, not a game you constantly bump into when dealing with arcade classics. Yet another Bally Midway game for the list is Kickman from 1982, which, similarly to Wizard of War and Omega Race, also had a lo-fi version for the Max machine and a better version for the C64. You control a clown on a unicycle, and you need to either deflect balloons that drop from the sky by using your feet, or pop them with your sharp headgear. At another point, your headgear will stack up the balloons before they get popped. Basically, it's a nice little breakout variation, but the unnecessarily frantic pacing and control speed makes Kickman an overall uncomfortable game. Although not one of my favorite games from Commodore, I used to play this a lot in my earlier C64ing days, mostly because it loaded up very quickly from turbo tape, just like all the others so far. I'm not sure whether Kickman was programmed in-house by Commodore people or whether it was a third-party development, but it doesn't feel like it was made by HAL Laboratory, who might have been responsible for all the next 8 titles. Reportedly, the first game ever to be published for the Commodore 64 was HAL Laboratory's Jupiter Lander, which was based on the 1979 Atari arcade game Lunar Lander. You control a lander with left and right thrusters and lifting thruster, and you have a finite amount of fuel. The idea is to land your lander on one of the 3 platforms with your speed indicator as close to 0 as possible, and the more risky the way down to the platform is, the better bonuses you will get. It's as simple as you can only expect from a first game for the platform, and it gets repetitive rather quickly, so I don't really play Jupiter Lander too often. That said, it's a good little piece of history worth having a go. Another certified HAL laboratory classic for the C64 is LeMans, which is somewhat based on Sega's 1979 arcade racer Monaco GP, which actually used a steering wheel, a gas pedal and a gear lever, so of course the C64 port would be a bit simplified. For many years I played Le Mans as a hacked version with joystick replacing paddle as the game controller, which to be honest is much more reliable and ultimately a more playable choice. But whichever controller you prefer, Le Mans is considered a bona fide C64 classic and hailed by many as being one of their favorite C64 racing games of all time, which I happen to agree with. Le Mans does have a few little tricks of its own, such as the 2-lane divisions, the quickly winding bits of road, and the relatively safe spot on the left edge of the road, which makes it a distinctly different experience from Monaco GP. One of the first cartridges in my collection was Clowns, a 1982 breakout-style game that requires paddles. If I remember correctly, it took me well over 20 years since getting my C64 to actually get to play this game, because I didn't purchase paddles until about 15 years ago. It's a nice little time waster that takes direct influence from Atari's Circus, but one can hardly call it a classic. I'm not even sure if it's a HAL laboratory game because neither the game's title screen or its packaging, including manual, feature any credits. But based on the font, I could make an educated guess and claim that it is a HAL piece of work. Another undisclosed developer was responsible for a Rally X conversion for the Max Machine and C64, but due to licensing issues they had to change the graphics and title, resulting in Radar Rat Race. Again, the font suggests that this is a HAL game, but who knows really? So yeah, maze racing with rats. And you need to collect all the cheese in order to proceed to the next maze. Good fun for its time, but was outdated in 1984, which means that by now it should be hilarious. I used to play this somewhat regularly in my early C64ing days, but after my collection got larger, I hardly ever came back to it, unless I felt like something light and silly was needed. Which I have to admit sometimes is the case. Even now. Here's another clearly HAL laboratory game, since it says so on the title screen, but I don't think Pinball Spectacular is really an accurately descriptive game, since it's more of a breakout thing in a pinball-like environment, rather than an actual pinball thing with flippers. But who cares, as long as it's spectacular. If you don't give the title too much notice, you will find there's a pretty good sort of a game behind all that style clashing. But hold on to your hats, because there's still a few more Commodore releases to go before we can get to the rest of the day's slightly more impressive, yet still early classics. This next one here is where HAL Laboratory dug up arcade history all the way back to 1976 and did a conversion of Atari's Night Driver. It's a first-person driving game in which the idea is to go as far as possible in the given time, and you can use either a joystick, a paddle or a keyboard to play it. The game was also released for the Max Machine as Road Race. probably my least favorite game release by Commodore, but there is an odd bit of nostalgia and scene history linked to this game. A single file compilation of old Commodore games called Cardrian Games was lumped together by a group called Computer Brains Cracking Service sometime in the 80s, of which the most notable member was Per Sundell, the creator of the CCS64 emulator. Somehow, Cardrian Games had found its way into one of my turbo tape compilations, and I used to load it up every now and then to play some of its games: Avenger, a Space Invaders clone from Commodore, Jupiter Lander, Night Driver, Omega Race, Wizard of War, or Kickman, most of which were the Max Machine versions. One game genre that I always look for in retro platforms that my interest gets piqued is pool, billiards, snooker, that sort of thing. And usually the simpler the better. This view is largely thanks to HAL Laboratories' 1983 Billiards game, which has been known to appear as pool, but Billiards is its official title. Upon first look, it appears a slightly simplified pool game with 6 score balls and a cue ball, but it has fairly nice physics. Also, perhaps surprisingly, it has a few different game modes, even a trick mode if you feel like more free-form dabbling. After LeMans, I suppose Billiards is my favorite HAL game for Commodore. Not too far behind is a game officially called Slalom, although back in the olden days it seemed to appear on turbo tapes and floppy disks mostly as Ski. This one was only ever officially released on the Max Machine as a cartridge, so I'm not really sure how this one ever even made it on the actual C64. Well, whatever the case with that, I'm glad it did, because this game is probably my favorite slalom skiing game of all time. It's simple but brilliantly designed to let you give yourself as much of a challenge as you want by pushing the fire button to accelerate. There are only 6 courses to finish, which get progressively harder, but with a little bit of practice, it's easy to beat the whole game. Once you do, take a year or two off and it feels fresh again. And now it's time to move on from Commodore's in-house game releases and move on to feature a few more early C64 games from other publishers. Atari's entry for today's list is Jungle Hunt from 1983, which probably should have been saved for an arcade episode, but I chose to include the C64 version due to its lack of finesse, which makes it more endearing to me than the higher quality original. Already from the title screen you can see the amount of time and effort put into some parts of this game, but then it's 1983, so you can't expect too much. You play as a Tarzan-like character whose mission is to get through 3 different areas of the jungle and save his Jane-like girlfriend from the clutches of some evil cannibals in the 4th level. Complete the game once and it starts over with a higher difficulty level, first marked by a differently colored jungle, then by the addition of monkeys on vines and other obvious difficulty increases. The few jingles in the game are programmed by someone with practically no musical ear whatsoever, and along with all the sound effects, everything sounds muddy, which was pretty common for American C64 game developers at the time. The graphics are good enough, if not exactly pretty, and for a gamer in PAL area the graphics are a bit juddery, thanks to the lack of optimization. None of that really mattered in my childhood though, because the game was fun and playable and provided enough fun that it would often be played a few runs in a semi-accidental manner, just because it happened to be one of the more common games on turbo tape compilations. Having the game on cartridge isn't quite the same thing, but it always manages to present a trip to the past. I also wrote a comparison of Jungle Hunt in April 2020, so if you haven't read it yet, and feel the sudden urge to do so, The link can be found in the video description. For a long time, the name A. Trott, short for Andrew Trott, was for me synonymous with a Quix clone for the C64 by the name of Stix. This was released by Supersoft in 1983, although I didn't actually learn of it until well after emulation came along, thanks to the way the game sneaked into my collection. To this day, Stix remains my favorite Quix clone, but to be honest, it has more to do with nostalgia than entertainment value. Stix is a fairly bare-bones version of the game with barely any sounds at all, and the graphics being rather preliminary. The gameplay is excellent though, which is what matters. Though I have to say the few sound effects the game has are what gives it an atmosphere you can't find in other Quix clones, particularly the heartbeat. Through this game, Supersoft became a latter-day obsession for me, and particularly Andrew Trott's games, of which there are no more than 3, Stix being his first one. It might not be a classic in a commercial sense, but it is one of the best hidden early gems that I can think of for the C64. Time for another arcade classic from Bally Midway, and this particular game was originally released in 1983 for the arcades. The C64 conversion of Tapper came out a year later, published by Sega in North America and US Gold in Europe. While the arcade original certainly looks and sounds better, the cheaper, blocky graphics and badly programmed music gives the C64 version its own particular funny edge that's very 1984 in a way. If you have somehow managed to let Tapper pass you by previously, the basic idea is you control a bartender and serve beer to patrons of the bar you happen to be serving in at any given level. Sometimes you spend only one shift at one bar, while at other times you might do more shifts at a different bar. Between every couple of shifts you get a bonus level in which you need to guess the correct can of beer that hasn't been shaken. As most arcade games of its time, Tapper can practically go on forever, but for as long as you get to see new bar interiors, the game can remain interesting. It might be worth pointing out that the original cartridge release features less environments and music, so if you want more variety, try the tape or disc version. Challenging it certainly is, even in the second level, and gets more challenging as you go on. When it does though, the game gives you the chance to rent a bit of entertainment with the tip money some of the patrons might leave you, which then will give some of the drinkers something else to focus on before they continue hogging down their pints. Classic arcade gaming in a slightly sloppy but funny C64 rendition, which is partly why the early C64 period is such a great part of the machine's catalog. It's also what makes one wish that Bally Midway's Timber and Domino Man had been converted for home systems, but no such luck. Now, a classic game with an uncertain release date is Broderband's all-time favorite, Choplifter, although most sources list it as having been released in 1982. In fact, the game's copyright says 1982, but only the original Apple II version of the game is known to having been released in 1982, and some C64 sleuths have tracked the American C64 release date as being no earlier than 1983, and the game didn't land Europe until 1984. Well, whatever the case, Choplifter is still one of the biggest classics of that time, and is one of the rare computer games that were converted to the arcades afterwards, instead of the other way around. In Choplifter, you fly a helicopter over a vast horizontal field, where your mission is to rescue prisoners of war from the ground and from huts which you first need to demolish before the prisoners can escape. Between you and the prisoners are enemy's fighter jets and artillery, so you need to deal with them first, if you want to keep yourself and your rescuees as safe as possible. You can only carry 16 people in your helicopter at any given time, and there are 64 to be rescued altogether. These days, gamers that have been exposed to high-quality graphics don't really seem to think much of the effort that was put into Choplifter, but the thing is, the graphics in Choplifter were state-of-the-art back in its day, and its style wasn't even attempted to be cloned properly for many years after its release, thus giving the game a unique spot in the early history of home computer gaming. For that reason alone, I think Choplifter is definitely worth putting time into. But it's still a very playable game, even after its many sequels. Our last game for today, and probably the most obscure game from today's list, is Monster Smash from Datamost 1984, which didn't even get added to the LeMans 64 database until a few weeks ago. Because this was apparently never released in Europe, the more knowledgeable of you can probably guess the method of how us non-Americans got to play this game at all. Well, this game puts you in charge of a monster smashing device. Monsters are dropped from the ceiling and they will always attempt to reach the right side of the room, which is the exit. The joystick controls are a bit weird at first, although you do get used to them quickly enough. Up and down control the gates between the white smashers, left operates the entire left side of the 12 smashers, and right operates the right side. Smashing monsters simultaneously rewards you with bonus score. At some point, human-like visitors will start appearing, which you need to avoid smashing. Also, when you see an egg, smash the egg and you will find a monster emerge from within the egg, so you need to smash that too. Simple but fun, and it has a nice progression of difficulty. Until I started preparing for this episode, I had no idea that this game was originally written for the Apple II by Dave Eisler and released as Monster Mash by a short-lived company called The Software Farm Incorporated in 1982. The Atari conversion from 1983 was also written by Dave Eisler, and the C64 version was co-written by Dave Eisler and Mark Riley. This might make for an interesting setup for a comparison, though it is an obscure title. Perhaps someday, who knows?